welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, the Dirt Files. Labor accused of distributing dossiers on Victorian Greens candidates. Macquarie Bank criticised by their former executive director for suing victims of an alleged telco finance scam. And can you hold a rally in favour of moderation? Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert attempt to restore sanity in Washington, D.C. Our panel tonight, lawyer and broadcaster Kara Greiner, Craig Reucassel from the Chaser, and in Melbourne, Chris Berg from the Institute of Public Affairs. Victorian Premier John Brumby has formally kicked off the state election campaign, visiting Government House to deliver the writs. Victorians will go to the polls on November 27, and already the dirty tricks have begun. The Age is reporting today that senior Labor figures have contacted influential members of the Jewish community in an attempt to peddle claims that a Greens candidate is an anti-Semite. That slur is based on Greens candidate and barrister Brian Walters, once representing alleged Nazi war criminal Conrad Calais. Mr Walters, who is running against Education Minister Bronwyn Pike in the marginal seat of Melbourne, says he's a target of a smear campaign.
I mean, here we have the rise of the Greens, and the major parties are not able to respond with innovative policies. Instead, they react in this gutter style of attacking people, and it's kind of more like Richard Nixon's 1970s rather than modern Australian democracy.
Chris, the Age say they have obtained a dossier of documents used to smear Brian Walters. It seems that Labor's pretty desperate.
I mean, it's a terrible start to that campaign. We've just heard John Brumby say that he's going to outline a positive plan for Victoria. But the first thing that the Labor Party does is say that someone hates Jews. And they're so concerned about the Greens. You can see how badly they're worried about the Greens in some of the inner city Melbourne seats. I think they're really desperate, and you sort of understand why, because it's an old government. It seems like quite a tired government, and the Greens are really pushing forward in the seats that they need to maintain.
Kara, a lot of people will be asking the question, why would someone like Brian Walters defend an alleged war criminal, Nazi war criminal? Did Brian Walters have any choice in the matter? Is this where it comes to this, what the lawyers call the cab rank principle?
Most good barristers do abide by the cab rank principle. There are certain exceptions when you can say no, but the whole principle behind the cab rank rule is that everyone deserves a proper defence. Doesn't matter if they're popular, doesn't matter if they're fat, doesn't matter if they're ugly. Barristers should represent whoever is next in line. And that's what he's saying happened in this case. And of all the barristers I know, they do abide by that rule. So it looks to me like they're really being extraordinarily petty, claiming that he hates Jewish people just because he represented someone. I represent child murderers. Doesn't mean that I love people who kill, small children. It's a
or
very
simple.
Or any children. Yeah, big children as well as small children. So it's a pretty offensive thing, I think, for the Labor Party to come out and say.
Craig, I know you finished a law degree but never practised. But do you agree with this cab rank principle?
Yeah, look, I know that. I think if you talk to barristers, there are ways to get around it. You can always have scheduling issues and that kind of thing. But if you are actually a human rights lawyer, it's a little bit hard to argue that I don't think somebody, both sides should have somebody defending them. So I think that it's certainly, in a human rights field, the idea of standing up for someone like Conrad Calais, who did have a very patchy past and had been found guilty in a lot of other, judiciaries overseas and that. So he was a very touchy case, and obviously not somebody you'd be rushing to defend. But it's very hard to say that nobody should have been defending him. And given the cab rank rule, as Kara says, a lot of barristers do take it very seriously, and it is a crucial part of the law. So I think it's pretty rough now.
Chris?
Why did they stop at calling him an anti-Semite? Under their own argument, they could have just as easily called Brian Walters a Nazi. I mean, you can see that they're stretching so far when their own logic doesn't hold up.
Chris, what's their logic like on the other case that they've raised, the case where Brian Walters was working for a mining company? They're trying to say, well, how could you do that if you're a Greens candidate? How could you do that when the Greens actually want to get rid of coal mining in Australia?
Well, I think that's exactly the same, because obviously the Greens don't want to keep the Nazis in Australia. So obviously he's allowed and should be working for companies that, as a Greens candidate, he might not support particularly much or want to phase out. But part of this, I think, there's a certain irony in this. And he should be allowed to work for the coal company, but the Greens have spent many, many decades trying to slur people by association, saying, oh, you met a coal company person or you hang around with tobacco companies or anything like that. This is actually just being thrown back in their face. I think it's unfair, but there's a certain bit of irony that I don't really mind.
But it's a different thing if you meet with somebody from a coal company and then happen to write a report in their favour. That's a very different thing to, defending somebody and then opposing their actual opinion or opposing them. And particularly when it's a workplace relations case, it's not even a case of... It's not like he's defending them and saying there shouldn't be a, CPRS or something like that. So I don't think that analogy works, really. I mean, he's clearly opposed to them.
You've also got to wonder what coal company would brief someone who's been a greenie for that long. I mean, that doesn't show an enormous amount of intelligence.
Yeah, maybe he's a good barrister. Kara,
he might be a very, very talented lawyer.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. It's good to see greenies that are talented lawyers and not just good shoe throwers. I'm impressed.
Kara, does this play into the hands of the Greens, the Labor tactics here?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it actually makes him look more ethical, because when he's being able to show on a professional level that he will abide by this principle of being open and defending whoever comes along, then I think that shows that he's probably a good candidate for Parliament.
Craig, what about the idea that the Liberals are still refusing to rule out a Liberal-Greens preference swap? Although Ted Baillieu says the deal's unlikely. Should the Libs preference the Greens?
Well, I don't know what good it necessarily does them, because they don't necessarily get anything back from preferencing the Greens. So, getting a Green to topple a Labor person is not necessarily in their favour, because as we saw in the federal sphere, the Greens are more likely, if it was a hung parliament, to line up with Labor anyway. So unless they can actually get some kind of preference deal where it's going to be beneficial for them in other seats where they might be able to topple Labor, I don't think, necessarily getting a Green to topple Labor makes too much difference in the long run to the figures there.
Chris Berg, what do you think about preference deals with the Greens and the Libs?
It's a purely strategic question for them. The purpose of a political party is to get in power, and anything else is secondary, surely, from the perspective of the political strategist, at least. I think the more interesting question is, what if you vote Liberal, and should you put the Greens second on a personal level? And I think it's very clear that if you share some of the Liberals' beliefs, then it'd be hard to share some of the Greens' beliefs. So there are two separate things. What should the party do from a strategic point, and what should Liberal voters do to satisfy their own preferences?
And Kara, from a strategic point of view, Barry O'Farrell, the New South Wales Liberal leader, came out today and made it clear what they should do. He said there's no prizes for coming second.
Absolutely. You've got to win. There's no point being in opposition for an extra 3 years. I have a problem with preferences, because it's really just a guide to your voters. So, as Chris said, it then comes down to the personal choice. Do it. Absolutely. It's number one is, the position you're going for. So preference away if you think it's going to get you there.
Yep, it's politics. Well, there's been praise for the federal government's much maligned school halls program during a Senate inquiry today. Brad Ogle, the head of the task force investigating the program, says outside of New South Wales, the program looks to have been implemented very well, with significant benefits to schools. Now, things got heated during hearings when Liberal Senator Brett Mason demanded to know if Brad Ogle thought taxpayers had received value for money. It was then that Labor Senator Gavin Marshall intervened.
Well, you actually trying to beat this up and make political points.
No, it's
right?
Commonwealth money. The Commonwealth is entitled to know whether it's achieved value for money out of taxpayers' money.
All you've tried to do
fair.
all day is to try and get Mr Ogle to agree with your political assessment to suit your political purposes.
It's not that.
And it annoys you when you don't get that cooperation.
That's not right, Senator Marshall. The entire nation knows there wasn't value for money from the project.
That's not the evidence.
That's
not the evidence.
That is the evidence.
You want to spin the evidence we've seen today to say that, and that's simply not the evidence.
We've just gone through the early tables.
We would not.
And in every single jurisdiction except WA, I think.
No. So is that your conclusion, Mr. Ogle?
No, we would not conclude. We would not concur.
You say it's too early, don't you?
We would not. There is no evidence to say that value for money has not been achieved. We would say that we want to see the full evidence before reaching such a conclusion.
That was Brad Ogle there. And Chris, Brad Ogle says there's no evidence to say that value for money has not been achieved. Are you sold on the school halls yet?
I don't think I'm quite sold on the school halls yet, because the school halls' purpose was A, to give school halls, but B, to save the Australian economy. And frankly, the evidence that that the Australian economy has been saved because of the school halls program and because of the insulation program hasn't actually come in, and we'll probably won't know for many, many years.
But Chris, did they say save the economy, or did they say stimulate the economy?
Well, they've been arguing that they saved the economy through their stimulus package. So unless there's any other techniques that they had that they didn't tell us about. Even the Treasury Secretary, Ken Henry, has said we probably won't know for nearly a decade about whether this package works. So in a way, Brett Mason's debate about the school halls program, whether it's value for money, is a little separate. If school halls are worth building, they're worth building, and I'm glad that we have them. But that doesn't really go to the political point, which is how effective was the stimulus package at saving the economy?
Surely you can't argue, though, that it didn't save jobs, at least create jobs. I mean, there was, the building sector would have been a lot worse off had it not been for the BER and that kind of stimulus. So whether it saved the whole economy, it certainly saved jobs and created employment.
Certainly it shifted jobs into the building sector of the economy. But the real question when you assess these sort of stimuluses is where did it take those jobs from, and where did it take the money from to put into one side of the economy? It's not as simple as saying, well, now there are a lot of builders. Are there fewer accountants than there were? Are there fewer manual labourers?
I don't think anyone who built any of school halls used to be an accountant. The reality is that we have a very large sector of our economy, which is we're actually in the building industry, and that sector of the economy was actually shrinking. So,
Craig, you joke, but that was actually the theory behind both the building the school halls revolution and the insulation package, that particularly in insulation, that everybody was supposed to get fired and then move into insulation. The reason they chose it was because it was an easy profession to get into. So they did actually plan to shift people into sectors of the economy that they stimulated.
Kara, what's your take on this?
Well, I thought the interim report came out and said that there were really only problems with 2.7%. So for me, I think that what we saw in the Senate's inquiry today just looked like spin gone bad, and that a 97% success rate's pretty good.
Chris, quick response from you on that one?
Yeah, a 97% success rate's pretty good. If I'm not sure what the people who are opposing it said beforehand, but no, I think that's a pretty good response rate. And if we've got good school halls, that's great. But it doesn't prove the political point about the efficacy of the stimulus package.
I must admit, I was surprised that John Clark seemed to be a member for the Labor Party then. I thought I was watching the games again.
Yes, no, it should be on 24/7, those Senate inquiries. Now in an opinion piece today in the Fairfax papers, former Federal Minister for Communications, Helen Coonan, calls for greater investment into Australia's high-speed rail services, saying commuting between cities by train is far too slow. The government has committed to a high-speed rail feasibility study, but it could be years before findings are released. Helen Coonan argues the government has spent too much on those school halls, and not enough on transport infrastructure. Craig, what do you think? Should we be rolling out this kind of fast rail?
Well, I certainly don't think we should have run it out quickly as a kind of stimulus package, because the last thing you want is...